On a cold January morning in the year 1318, a 7-year-old girl trembled with fear and cold as servants pulled a heavy ceremonial dress over her. The golden fabric adorned with jewels seemed an unbearable burden for her small body. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks, and a lady-in-waiting tried to calm her, but to no avail. These were not the whims of a child. The girl was crying because today she was being given in marriage to a man almost 30 years her senior, a foreign king whom she hardly knew and whose cruelty was already the subject of rumors. This girl was Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV. On this day, her long journey began, from a defenseless victim to one of the most dangerous women in medieval Europe. The marriage of Isabella and Edward II, King of England, had nothing to do with love. It was difficult to even call it a normal union. It was a deal wrapped in diplomatic words. At that time, France and England were constantly fighting over Gascony, a region rich in wine. For Philip IV, known as the Fair, an intelligent and calculating monarch, his youngest daughter was nothing more than a pawn on the political chessboard. She was a living coin that could be used to secure a temporary peace. England got a princess with royal blood, and France got an ally right at the English court, close to the enemy throne. No one asked little Isabella what she thought about being separated from her family and living in a foreign country where she didn't even know the language. The fate of princesses was decided by others. They were born as political tools, and Isabella was no exception. The wedding took place in Boulogne with luxury and ostentatious royal pomp. Edward II was 23 years old at the time. He was tall, strong, and considered by many to be one of the most handsome men of his time. But when the young bride entered the cathedral, what should have been the happiest day of her life already seemed like a nightmare. The king could barely hide his indifference. All his attention was focused not on her, but on Piers Gaveston, his closest friend and, as rumored, his lover. While Isabella stood silently under the weight of the crown, Edward and Gavignon exchanged knowing glances. The gifts intended for the bride immediately ended up in Gavignon's hands, and he proudly showed them off. This humiliation in front of everyone was only the first episode in a long series of years of neglect and pain. One chronicler of the time wrote, "The little queen sat alone and silent, while the king danced all night with his beloved Piers." Isabella's first years in England were filled with loneliness. Formally, she was queen, but in essence, she was just a child, torn from her family and living in a foreign country where almost no one spoke her language. Her husband rarely visited her, preferring to spend all his time with Gaveston, spending public money on him. At first, the English nobles sympathized with the young queen, but then all their anger turned against the favorite, whose influence over Edward seemed boundless. In 1312, this tension erupted into open violence. Haveloka, who had already been expelled several times but always returned, was captured by rebellious lords led by the Earl of Lancaster. Without trial or investigation, he was taken to a lonely hill and beheaded. His head was sent to London as a terrifying message to the king. Edward's response was unbridled grief. He did not leave his chambers for several weeks, refusing to eat or speak to anyone, mourning his loss. Isabella, who was already 12 at the time, was still assigned the role of a mere figurehead wife. Isabella, who at first watched her husband's grief with childish incomprehension, eventually understood the main thing. Being queen did not mean being important. The chronicler wrote that the death of Gawain should have been the moment when Edward finally turned his attention to his wife. But instead, he simply replaced one favorite with another. And this time, an even more dangerous one. This was Hugh Despenser, a harsh and ambitious aristocrat who quickly subjugated the weak king. 4 years passed. By the time Isabella reached marriageable age, she'd already learned the harsh rules of court life. Edward, who had previously shown little interest in her, now saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. She had to give birth to an heir. In 1316, Isabella gave birth to a son, the future Edward III. They went on to have 3 more children, and for a time her position was secure. But it didn't last long. Edward soon forgot about his wife again, completely captivated by Despenser, who by that time had already managed to get his hands on land, titles, and influence. Isabella saw all this, remembered it, and waited. Everything changed when the king and his favorite began to take away her own possessions and income. The queen was deprived of her financial independence. Her servants were expelled, her jewels were taken away, and she was forced to beg humbly for money to maintain her court, wrote the monk. This humiliation was the last straw. A new strength awakened in Isabella, unexpected even to those who had known her for many years. The same girl who had once arrived in England frightened and frightened was now a grown woman, ready to fight for herself and her future. Her chance came in 1325. Relations with France had deteriorated, and a diplomatic mission was needed. Isabella, who was 25 at the time, spoke French and English fluently and volunteered to go to negotiate with her brother, Charles IV, who had become King of France. Edward reluctantly agreed to send her as his representative. This decision proved fatal. It cost him his throne and ultimately his life. Once in Paris, Isabella did not return. Instead, she met Roger Mortimer, an Englishman in exile and enemy of the Plantagenets, who had previously managed to escape from the Tower. At first, their alliance was political, but very quickly a passionate romance blossomed between them. Charismatic, determined, and thirsty for revenge, Mortimer saw Isabella as the perfect partner in a conspiracy against Edward. For Isabella herself, he became both a source of support and a chance to avenge years of humiliation. The queen, who had long been a lamb, turned out to be a wolf, wrote one chronicler. At the French court, Isabella no longer looked like an obedient wife. Now she was a wronged queen and mother, concerned about the future of her son, the heir to the English throne. She openly declared that she would not return to England while the Despensers remained in power. Edward was furious. He ordered his wife to return immediately. When she refused, he tried to force her to obey by using their son, her most vulnerable point. The king sent young Edward, who was only 12 years old, to Paris, supposedly to meet his mother. In reality, it was a cunning plan to lure Isabella back by playing on her maternal feelings. But she already knew how to play such games. Isabella secured official recognition of her son as Duke of Aquitaine and arranged for him to make a legitimate trip to France to pay homage to the French king for this region. Reunited with her son, Isabella finally completed her transformation from victim to avenger. Now she had an heir to the English throne, the support of France, and an army of mercenaries assembled by allies from the Netherlands. Together with Roger Mortimer, she began to prepare an invasion of England. In September 1326, Isabella returned home not as a submissive queen, but as a military leader at the head of an army. Instead of fear, she was greeted with jubilation. The English people, tired of the chaos, royal weakness, and lawlessness under the Despenses, saw Isabella as their liberator. The nobility, clergy, cities, and common peasants declared their support for the good queen in her fight against the evil king. Edward and the Despenses fled west, trying to hide in Wales, but were quickly captured. Isabella had no intention of forgiving them. Her revenge was swift and merciless. Hugh Despenser, the man who had humiliated her for many years and usurped power, was brought before a sham court. His execution was one of the most brutal in medieval history. First, he was dragged through the streets, tied to horses. Then he was hung on a high pole for all to see. But that was not the end of it. He was taken down while still alive, tied to a ladder, and mutilated. First, his genitals were cut off and burned right in front of him. Then his entrails were removed and burned. Finally, his heart was torn out and thrown into the fire. Only then was he beheaded. All this was done deliberately to intimidate others. Now Isabella, once humiliated and deprived of power, decided who would live and who would die. To complete her revenge, she forced Edward to abdicate the throne in favor of their son, the young Edward III. The deposed king was initially kept in relative comfort at Kenilworth Castle, but attempts by his supporters to arrange his escape forced him to be moved to a more gloomy fortress, Berkeley Castle. It was there, in September 1327, that the darkest episode in Isabella's reign took place. The death of Edward II is still a matter of controversy, but the most widespread and most terrifying version speaks of deliberate murder. According to contemporary accounts, the executioners, probably acting on Mortimer's orders and with Isabella's tacit consent, inserted a red-hot metal tube into the former king's anus. This method was intended to cause fatal damage to his internal organs without leaving any marks on his body, so that it could later be claimed that he had died of natural causes. Edward's cries of pain were so loud that, according to witnesses, they could be heard outside the castle, echoing in the darkness. Thus ended the life of a man who once ruled England, lost the Battle of Bannockburn, preferred rowers and favorites to his wife, and ultimately died in unspeakable agony at the hands of the very girl he had ignored all his life. After his death, and with his son still a minor, Isabella and Mortimer became the de facto rulers of England. They no longer hid their relationship, living openly together and enjoying luxury, which caused increasing irritation. Their regime began seizing the property of their opponents, amassing enormous wealth. Mortimer gave himself the unprecedented title of Earl of March, placing himself above all the nobility. The barons who had once supported Isabella in her struggle against Edward now found themselves under the yoke of an even more harsh and despotic regime. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer kept the young king and the entire country under their control. Isabella finally gained the power that had been denied her for so long during her marriage. She was no longer a victim. Now she ruled, but like her husband, she made a fatal mistake. She failed to notice how a new generation had grown up. The young Edward III, now a teenager, was becoming increasingly aware of what was happening at court. He remembered that, despite his father's weaknesses and mistakes, Edward II had been publicly humiliated, deposed, and then probably killed on the orders of his own mother and her lover. This feeling never left him. One night, using a secret passage in Nottingham Castle, where the court was then located, Edward and a group of loyal allies broke into Mortimer's chambers. According to legend, Isabella threw herself at her son's feet and begged, "My handsome son, spare the good Mortimer." But he paid no attention to her tears. Mortimer was immediately arrested, accused of usurping power, and hanged as a common traitor on Tyburn gallows. Surprisingly, Edward spared his mother. She was not tried or put to shame. She was simply removed from court, stripped of her influence, and deprived of her lands. But she retained a generous pension and was allowed to live in peace. The young king showed political wisdom rare for his age, which would become his distinguishing feature in the future. He understood that if he executed his own mother, it would be not only a political failure, but also a moral disaster. Isabella of France, who was later nicknamed the She-Wolf, spent the remaining 28 years of her life in almost complete seclusion at Castle Rising in Norfolk. Some said she had gone mad, tormented by nightmares and visions of her dead husband. Others claimed she had found peace, devoting herself to prayer and charity. When Isabella died in August 1358, she was 67 years old. She was buried in a nun's habit with a reliquary containing the heart of Edward II on her chest. A final gesture of repentance, or a symbol of her attempt to forgive and be forgiven. Servants and the few guests who visited her in her seclusion said that the former queen sometimes talked to empty space. At night she was heard screaming in French, calling for her father or son, and sometimes she whispered Edward's name as if he were standing at her bedside. One servant recalled that in her final months she had 2 chairs placed in her room, facing each other, one for her and one for her husband, whom she had once ordered to be killed. She asked forgiveness from the empty air, he wrote in a note that was later preserved by monks, and at times seemed to hear answers that none of us could hear. The few courtiers who visited her noticed how she would suddenly interrupt the conversation and stare into the corner of the room as if someone were standing there. In the last days of her life, she asked to be buried not in royal robes and jewels, but in simple monastic clothing. Such requests were not uncommon among repentant nobles, but in her case, it sounded like an admission of her mistakes. After her death, an anonymous poem appeared which spoke of the duality of her fate: a girl who cried at her own wedding, a woman who shed blood in revenge, a queen who held a sword in her hands, a sinner who prayed until her death. The story of Isabella of France is one of the most turbulent and controversial in the history of medieval Europe. She began as a child bride, forced to marry a man she never chose. She became a queen who was neglected and humiliated, a mother who decided to defend her son's rights, a mistress consumed by a thirst for revenge, a cruel ruler, and in the end, a recluse immersed in remorse. Isabella lived a life full of twists and turns, from tragedy to power, from power to downfall. Her journey, from innocence to moral collapse, reveals the harsh truth about medieval power and the consequences of unbridled ambition. But perhaps the main lesson of her fate is the fragility of the position of women, even those in the highest positions. She came to England as a pawn in a political game, a girl sacrificed for the sake of an alliance between 2 countries. The fact that she later turned into a predator does not negate the fundamental tragedy of her life. After her fall, many were quick to condemn her. The chronicler Thomas Wolsey wrote, "She was a woman of rare beauty but of questionable morals, a queen with a cruel heart and a broken mind." But such words say more about the fear of independent women in that era than about an objective assessment of her actions. If we recall everything she went through, a forced marriage as a child, years of humiliation, her husband's indifference, his open passion for his mistresses, and then the deprivation of her income, then Isabella's rebellion looks not just like an ambitious attempt to seize power, but a desperate attempt to survive in a system where women had no chance. Her relationship with Mortimer was particularly revealing. In the chronicles of the time, she was portrayed as an immoral adulteress, but modern research suggests more complex feelings. For a woman who never experienced intimacy in marriage, Mortimer's care and attention, even if partly political, may have been the first human warmth she ever felt. After 20 years of isolation far from her homeland, she finally met someone who saw her not just as a queen or the mother of heirs, but as a living person. The most controversial moment of her life, the possible murder of Edward II, also needs to be rethought. It is commonly believed that Isabella acted out of revenge, but the political context points to a more cold-blooded calculation. While the former king was alive, he remained a symbol for the discontented. In the first months of his imprisonment, several plots to free him were uncovered. In those days, showing mercy often meant death for the person who showed it, and perhaps saving Edward's life was considered an unacceptable risk. This, of course, does not justify the horrific method, if that is indeed what happened. The red-hot metal tube, which left no marks on the body, speaks both of the cruelty of the era and of the desire to hide the traces of the murder by passing it off as a natural death. But the darkest question here is not even whether Isabella ordered her husband's murder, but whether she specified how it should be done. Some modern historians doubt that Edward II died in Berkeley in 1327. According to one alternative version, he managed to escape, possibly with the help of his guards. He allegedly spent the rest of his life in Italy, hiding under a different name. A letter from Pope John XXIII was found in the Vatican, in which he mentions a meeting with a man he considered to be the deposed English king, several years after the official date of his death. Although this version is interesting, it remains on the fringes of academic research. Unlike her turbulent life, Isabella's death was surprisingly peaceful. This moment was described as a strange sense of calm, a quiet end to a life full of passion, struggle, and pain. It is said that her last words were, "All shadows merge with darkness at the end." Whether she found redemption in her final years is unknown, but her story remains as a warning about how power can destroy, how revenge, even when it seems justified, rarely brings true liberation. Perhaps the most striking thing about Isabella's fate is her resilience. In a world where power belonged almost entirely to men and women were easily removed as soon as they became inconvenient, she did not just stay alive. She changed her destiny completely, from victim to avenger, from an obedient girl to a woman who briefly rewrote the rules of medieval politics. Yes, her triumph was short-lived, and her end was lonely, but that does not diminish the strength of character she displayed. Even today at Castle Rising, where Isabella spent her last years, visitors report strange sensations in her chambers. It is as if something remains, unquenched, alive, untouched by time. Night watchmen and tour guides whisper about a female figure in medieval clothing who appears during thunderstorms. They say she stands on the castle wall looking south, toward London. It is as if she is still searching for the power she once had and lost. And it was the same cruel world that turned a little princess into the child bride of an indifferent king. The same world that gave birth to the Wolf Queen, who returned to destroy it. Isabella was not born a monster. She became one because time made her that way. And perhaps this is the most disturbing truth of her life. The most terrifying monsters are those we create ourselves.